Hello, this is Gallifreyan Jedi speaking, and I would like to welcome you to my YouTube channel. And for this month's blog, the month of July, I will be taking a short break from my Star Wars and Doctor Who Mythology series, which I know from the previous month that I had promised or had said that this month's topic will be on Doctor Who Mythology number 2, Gallifrey and the Time Lords. I will not be doing this topic this month. That will be next month, because this month I want to tackle for this blog. I want to tackle a subject that I have great intense interest in and great concern as well. For I will be revisiting Disney's invalidation of the Star Wars expanded universe. And the reason why I'm doing that, let me explain a little bit behind my reasoning why I'm tackling this subject, is approximately a year ago when I first started my YouTube channel. I did a video called The Canonicity of the Star Wars Expanded Universe, in which I tackled some of these issues which I'm going to be talking about today. And it was one of my earliest videos that I had done. And at the time, what I did is I first gave an overview of the entire history of the Star Wars expanded EU universe. EU is the initials for the expanded universe, so that's what I will use from now on for Star Wars. It's Star Wars EU, meaning Star Wars expanded universe. But I gave an entire history of the Star Wars EU. Then I tackled the controversial issue of Disney's decision to decanonize the entire EU and then reboot it as they go forth with the future of Star Wars, the future of the franchise. And at the time, I tried to be a diplomat and build a bridge between those fans who loved the Star Wars EU, including myself, and who felt disheartened and disenfranchised that it was decanonized and put under the Legends banner, and essentially building that bridge, and with also Disney's decision on the direction they were taking the franchise into. So I tried to build a diplomatic bridge between the two. But see, ever since then, I've learned a lot of things. I've come to learn a lot of things through various sources, especially, not the least, which is when I went out to Star Wars Celebration in Anaheim, California. And what I have done since then is I've done a 180-degree turn on my position, my opinions and position of where Disney's taken the franchise in, especially over the invalidation and the decanonization of the Star Wars EU. For I no longer am trying to build that bridge. I am taking a stand against Disney. I am totally against Disney. Like I said, I have taken a 180-degree turn from where my position was when I first did that video. And the reason why I am doing this month on this topic, on the Star Wars EU, again, is I know that I promised. Let me back up a little bit. I had mentioned before in one of my other blogs, probably the one I did on my assessment of Star Wars Celebration in Anaheim, that I said that I probably will be tackling the Star Wars EU again and the controversy over Disney's decision to decanonize it, probably sometime in the fall, or maybe around the time that Episode VII, The Force Awakens, is released in the theaters. But I felt this is probably a good time to tackle this, and the reason why is, even after a year since the time I did the canonicity on the Star Wars EU video, I am surprised at how many comments that I'm still getting, how many reactions and comments, some of them positive, some of them negative. And I want to set the record straight on where my position has changed, on what my position has changed, and why my position has changed. And I want to nuance these things because I think it's important. I'm leaving that video up there because not only because it gets a lot of viewers, but and I enjoy the comments that still come to me, but I like I'm satisfied with the history, the overall history of the Star Wars EU, from the dates of the pre-Republic and Old Republic era all the way up to the pretty close. I didn't include the Fate of the Jedi, but Legacy of the Force and stuff like that. So I gave an overall history, and I'm pretty satisfied with that. So I want to keep that video up there for others to view in the future. But I also want to make this new video because I felt convicted, even though I said I was going to tackle this at a later date. I felt convicted this is the perfect time to deal with this issue, to get these issues out on the table, to expose them, to share what I feel, why I've changed my opinions and my thoughts and my feelings, and basically my position over Disney, over these issues. And I thought that this would be a perfect time to tackle that. But the nice thing about that, on this topic, is, like I said, I do plan for the month of August to do that Doctor Who Mythology #2 blog on Gallifrey and the Time Lords. So that is my plan, and what I did is I set up a schedule starting from this month on this topic, on revisiting the Star Wars EU. I made I made an outline, or shall I say, I made a list of topics that I will be covering each month right up to the end of the year. And but anyway, I just want to share that so to assure people that next month, if you're looking forward to the Doctor Who Mythology blog on Gallifrey and the Time Lords, that will be covered in the month of August. But let's jump in now to revisiting Disney's invalidation of the Star Wars EU. But in doing so, I just want to cover a couple things real quick, because I know the main topic is going to be on the Star Wars EU. But I want to cover real quick some of my worst fears, what I call the worst fears, with the direction that Disney is taking with the with the Lucasfilm franchise already. Want to talk about real quick about Star Wars Rebels and Star Wars Episode VII, The Force Awakens. Some issues there. Now, I did see I did watch earlier this week. I didn't see it when I was at the convention, the Celebration Anaheim convention, but I did see it when they aired the 1-hour premiere of Siege of Lothal, when it was on Disney XD, and they aired that on Disney XD a couple weeks ago. And so I want to talk about that real quick, because I did watch that episode. The season 2 premiere, which was an hour long, interesting because that was the premiere for the series was an hour long, and they presented that. I kind of felt it was very misleading, which I talk about on my review for season 1 of Star Wars Rebels. It's kind of misleading when they said that they were going to have they were going to have a movie premiere for the series. The reason why I felt that way, I'll repeat it again, even though I nuanced it pretty well in my review for Star Wars Rebels. And the reason being, I felt that it was misleading, is when they said it was a movie, I had in mind, and I'm pretty sure, well, it's hard to say what other people are thinking at the time, but it's hard to get around to thinking that Star Wars: The Clone Wars had a movie premiere, and that was a real movie premiere. That was hour and 40 minutes, hour and a half, hour and 40 minutes, close to a 2-hour movie, and it was in the theater. So that was a real movie premiere for the series of the Clone Wars. And when they heard that they were going to have an hour premiere, they were going to have a movie premiere for Rebels, that's what I had in mind. I thought it was going to be a 2-hour movie, just like the Clone Wars was. But it wasn't. It was an hour episode, or maybe two episodes put into one, like they do sometimes. And they called it the movie premiere for Star Wars Rebels, and I kind of thought that was misleading. Now, I'm not going to go too further into it. I probably said more than I should, because that's dealing with Season 1, and I've already did my review for Season 1, which is unfair when I'm talking about Season 2. But Season 2 had that hour premiere episode called The Siege of Lothal, and I felt was an improvement for the series. very much like the season 1 finale, Fire Across the Sky. So I will give the devil its due. The reason why I'm talking about, one of the reasons why I'm talking about Star Wars Rebels and Episode VII, Force Awakens, is I want to emphasize that even though I have these concerns or disagreements or things that I don't like about it, that I'm trying to stick with it long enough. I'm trying to stick with the series long enough, or Disney's vision, the Disney projects, shall I say, the Disney era of Star Wars, with the Disney projects for Star Wars, as they go forward with their agenda for the franchise. And I'm trying to stick with it long, very long, so no one can ever accuse me if I ever abandon them, because I've already I'm not going to get to that until later. The reboot, Disney, the Lucasfilm Disney rebooted EU. I've already abandoned, boycotting that. But if I have to abandon and boycott either the movies or the Rebel series, I don't want anybody to ever say to me that I'm blindly being biased. That means I have some issues, angst and issues that I have to crank out, that I'm angry at. So therefore that blinds me, and I just overlook any other projects, any of the Star Wars movies or TV series that Disney might create for Star Wars. And now some people do that. There are some people who have an issue, an angst to grind. They have an issue to grind because of angst and anger that they have. And that blinds them, pretty much blinds them. And then they won't give anything else a chance, even if it's great, even if it's good. And I don't want anybody to accuse me that because of my angst and the issue I have to grind with the Star Wars EU, that I'm letting that blind me to anything that's good with Star Wars Rebels or the sequel trilogy. Because, I'm treating Star Wars to me, even the negative one, even if, with all the negativity with Disney, with the sequel trilogy and with Rebels or anything else that Disney is doing, I'm treating it sort of like, think of it as the brother in the family who's the black sheep. You hate the things he does, but he's still family, he's still your brother, and you're going to defend him. Well, that's the way it is with me. Star Wars is like my family, and maybe the Disney projects, the sequel trilogy and Rebels, and their rebooted EU and stuff like that, etc., are like the brother who's the black sheep in the family. I don't like what they're doing, Disney is doing with the franchise, but because I love Star Wars so much, and because Star Wars is like a family to me, I'm still defending it. So I don't want anybody to ever say that I'm blindly just ignoring it because of my anger towards, my frustration towards Disney. I'm trying to stick with it long enough and give every chance. And I would give the devil its due. If something is good, even though I don't like Disney, if Disney does something with Star Wars and it's good, I'll give the devil its due. I'm not going to just sit there and say it's bad just because I've got issues with Disney. And that was pretty much what I felt about the Siege of Lothal. That it was good. I enjoyed it. I enjoyed it just as much as I enjoyed Fire Across the Galaxy, the season 1 finale for Fire Across the Galaxy. But there's still a long way to go. We have an entire season, and the rest of the season is not going to start until this fall. So I'm not going to give my review as of right now. I think that would be unfair to give a review for an entire season based on one episode. Whether it be good or bad is unfair either way. And that would be a biased, whether it be biased for or biased against. So I'm going to wait till the entire season is done, and when the entire season is done, entire season 2 is done, then I will give my review for season 2 of Rebels, and then give my final, because remember what I said with my review of season 1 of Rebels, that if season 2 doesn't pick up in its quality of stories, that I was going to give up the ghost. I was giving it a second season, because I was so disappointed with the first season. I was going to give it a second season, and if it didn't pick up, it was still like a repeat of season 1, then I was going to give up the ghost with it and move on. Quit watching the series. Well, it's still too early to tell, even one way or the other. even in spite of the fact that I did like the Siege of Lothal, I still want to wait until I see the entire season of Rebels. And after that, I will give my final verdict of the series. Moving on to Star Wars Episode VII, The Force Awakens. Although I'm still holding out hope, as I'm still planning to see Episode VII, The Force Awakens, when it comes out in December. There have been major developments among the rumors, rumorville, shall we say, of the plot that are quite disturbing. Now keep in mind, I'm going to be giving, hopefully these are not spoilers, I'm just giving away a little bit of the plot. A little bit of the plot, let me back up. A little bit of the plot as of rumors, not official, just of rumors that I've been gleaning off the web and off of other YouTube videos that I've been watching. So these are rumors. This is definitely not happening. It's not a definite. It could be, but not a definite. Okay, here's what the rumors are. It's rumored that the Battle of Jakku, you remember the planet we see in the trailer for Episode 7 is the planet Jakku, where a year after the Battle of Endor in Episode 6, Return of the Jedi, Battle of Jakku takes place. And that planet that we see in the trailer is the Battle of Jakku, where Star Destroyer is crashed to the ground, which is a result of that battle. Okay, so it's rumored that the Battle of Jakku will be a defeat for the Alliance to restore the Republic, and would cause the galactic civil war to go on for at least another 30 years as an endless war of attrition. Okay, so understand this, that one of the opinions that's coming out, or one of the rumors that's coming out, is a year after the Battle of Endor, the Battle of Jakku takes place, in which the Empire, just like the Battle of Endor, was a probably huge victory for the Alliance, the Rebel Alliance. Well, the Battle of Jakku, according to rumors, not definite, but according to rumors, is supposed to be a huge victory for the Galactic Empire. So this will, if this is true, then what's going to happen is it's going to destroy the entire victory at Endor. It's going to destroy the victory celebrations that you see all across the galaxy, that the Empire was defeated, the Emperor was dead, Vader is gone, and the galaxy now can taste freedom again. It's going to destroy that. It's going to destroy the formation of the New Republic, because the New Republic's never formed, because the Rebel Alliance was defeated and they are off still running. And what's going to happen is it's going to turn this war, which is very similar to, the Galactic Civil War is very similar to a combination of the American Revolution and World War II. That's what I compare to the two wars with, where they have a definitive goal and an end, to almost like a Vietnam kind of war, where it just goes on and on and on for decades as a war of attrition. And if that happens, that will, in my opinion, if there's any truth to that rumor, then that will not just undermine the Star Wars EU, but it will undermine everything. The essence of the Star Wars saga, the 6 movies and the Clone Wars series. It will undermine that. And well, anyway, let me move on. It's also rumored that Han and Leia, this is also disturbing, Han and Leia will never have been married. And that's a major contradiction from the EU, because anybody who has read the EU, especially with Timothy Zahn's Thrawn trilogy and on through the rest of the EU post Episode 6, Return of the Jedi, knows that Han and Leia got married. They had 3 children, Jason, Jaina, and Anakin. And so that's not just some small change in continuity. That's a huge continuity change. Now there's supposed to be, I'm getting the character that Daisy Ridley is playing. It's going to be like a Janus kind of character, Leia's daughter, That's what I'm assuming. And if that's true, then I guess she's Han's daughter too, but he has nothing. He's not in her life because the two of them, Han and Leia, are separated. They were never married. So she was born out of wedlock, and that just changes the entire continuity, and that's hard to accept. And although if that is the case, I might try as hard as I can to stomach that change, even though that's a major change, an incomprehensible change from the major continuity of the Star Wars EU. I'll try to accept that, but I cannot accept the previous change. If that's it. Now, I've heard another rumor with the Battle of Jakku that was the final victory for the Rebel Alliance. If that's the case, then I could probably get into and try to make some kind of bridge with the sequel trilogy and the discontinuity with the Star Wars EU, which I'm following still, the classic EU. I'll try that. But if it goes south the other way, where that's a defeat for the Rebel Alliance and a victory for the Galactic Civil War, where the Galactic Civil War turns into this 30-year war of attrition, that I cannot accept. That will undermine the entire continuity of the 6 saga films in the Clone Wars series. The essence of the Star Wars saga itself, it will undermine. Because, technically speaking, I mean, I can accept the way the Star Wars EU dealt with it, like you see in Timothy Zahn's Thrawn trilogy, and also Kevin J. Anderson's Jedi Academy trilogy, where you have fragments of the Empire still around, and individual battles. But technically speaking, overall, the Galactic Civil War ended with officially ended with the Battle of Endor in Episode VI, Return of the Jedi. And if they have the Battle of Jakku very much like a skirmish with remnants of the Empire, where the Rebel Alliance has their final victory over the Galactic Empire, then now I know that they're supposed to be in the time of Episode VII, The Force Awakens, remnant of the Empire turns into, that was a defeat. The Battle of Jakku was a defeat that would undermine the entire saga, the essence of the saga, and undermine the entire series from Episode 1 through Episode 6 and the Clone Wars series. That would be equivalent to changing the continuity of the entire saga. That would change the continuity the same way that J.J. Abrams changed the continuity with Star Trek in the first Star Trek movie, where he had the Romulans and Spock come from the future, I guess during the time of the era of Next Generation, DS9, and Voyager, from that time period, come from the future, and then change the entire history of the Federation and in the history of the characters of the series. I mean, he destroyed the entire continuity of 40 years of Star Trek history, with the original series, the movies, all the movies, including the 6 classic movies, along with the Next Generation, the 4 Next Generation movies, the Next Generation series, Deep Space Nine series, Voyager series, Enterprise series. Everything was Star Trek that preceded it. He destroyed the continuity. That's why I'm not crazy about J.J. Abrams' Star Trek. And I wasn't too crazy about him doing the sequel trilogy, but he did. Now the thing is that, like I said, if it's the former, where the Battle of Jakku is a skirmish, and it was the final victory of the Rebel Alliance over the Galactic Empire, I can live with that. But if J.J. Abrams has the Galactic Empire still in full force, and the Rebel Alliance was defeated at the Battle of Jakku, and it turned into a 30-year endless war of attrition, then he will have undermined the entire Star Wars saga, the same way he did undermine Star Trek. And I won't. And if that's the case, if that rumor turns out to be true, I will not follow I will not follow Episode VII, The Force Awakens, or the rest of the sequel trilogy. I will count that in my head as never have happened in the Star Wars universe. That will be undermined, in my opinion, in my mind. But like I said, I can't make those decisions because everything is just rumor now. I have to wait till the movie actually comes out to know what rumors are true and what rumors are false. So in the month of December, that will be my review. That will probably be the last review I do for the year of 2015. But the month of December of 2015, I will be doing a review, my own review, on Star Wars Episode VII, The Force Awakens. But I think that's all, because I spent a lot of time on that. I think it's time that we move on to the Star Wars EU and dealing with that controversy. And the first thing I wanted to deal with is deal with Lucasfilm under Disney and the likes of Pablo Hidalgo and Leland Chee in their position, because, like I said, it was pretty surprising listening to them while attending that panel on the canonicity of the EU while I was at Celebration in Anaheim. But anyway, let's start off. I used to assume that the invalidation of the Star Wars EU was the exclusive decision of Bob Iger and the other Disney CEO cronies. I call them cronies because they're acting very typical of corporate America, which I am not crazy about. I think corporate America is bad for America, but I'm not going to go into my politics right now. But anyway, moving on. And although they might have been at the center of that decision, I'm sure Bob Iger and the CEOs were the first ones and prime ones to come up with that decision. After attending Celebration in Anaheim, I learned that the conspiracy goes much deeper and more sinister, as I learned that the Lucasfilm, no longer the Disney banner, are very much in support of the decision to decanonize the EU. Imagine that. Imagine finding that out. I'm thinking the whole time that Bob Iger and the Disney CEOs, they made a decision. They said, okay, well, let's get rid of the Star Wars EU, and they go to Lucasfilm, to Kathleen Kennedy and to Pablo Hidalgo and to Leland Chee and the rest on the story group. They say you got to get rid of you got to decanonize and invalidate the Star Wars EU and get rid of it. And I had in my mind where these guys, Kathleen Kennedy and the rest of the story group, Chee and Hidalgo, are like, oh gosh, we don't want to do this because we've been a huge supporter. When Lucasfilm was under George, we were huge supporters of the Star Wars EU and explained how it worked in the canonicity of the franchise. And they didn't want to do it. Imagine how deeply disturbing it was and frustrating to find out that after thinking that these guys were just the victims of corporate decision, that they're actually part of this conspiracy, they're actually part of this decision, and they are in full support of this decision. That was very disturbing, very upsetting. Changed my mind a lot. That's what really did it for me. And that's partially why because it was in April that I went to Celebration in Anaheim, and it's now that I'm deciding to do this blog, revisit, on the topic of the Star Wars EU and Disney's invalidation of it. And part of the reason why I'm doing this early, this month, rather than later, like in the fall, is probably because of my experience at Celebration Anaheim back in April. And anyway, moving on. And keep in mind, I'm going to use Lucasfilm Disney as sort of, instead of just Disney by itself, Lucasfilm Disney, because Lucasfilm is now a distinct company, but it's under Disney. It's part of Disney, so it's distinct, but yet a part of Disney. So and the reason why I'm adding Lucasfilm in is because learning that they're not so innocent. Their hand is not being forced. That they're in full decision of it. So I'm using it now as a term as Lucasfilm /Disney. So Lucasfilm Disney Story Group, started by Kathleen Kennedy and run by the likes of Pablo Hidalgo and Leland Chee, are now fully supporting Disney's decision to decanonize the entire classic Star Wars EU and reboot it in their own image. They're doing this partially because they are company men who are essentially yes men, quote unquote, quote, yes men, unquote, to Disney, whose motivation is to save their jobs rather than preserve the integrity of the franchise. And so essentially part of the reason is, like I said, they're company men. Call them company men, which is a euphemism for saying that they're yes men to Disney. And being Disney, someone who is passionate about the franchise as much as I am, loves the Star Wars EU as much as I do. I guess my vision would be if I was working for them. Of course, I'm not. You have to always be humble because you never know what you're going to do in a situation until you're actually in that situation. But you have, but being that as it may, I always envision myself that I would care more about the integrity than my job. So if Bob Iger and the CEOs of Disney came to me and said, you got to decanonize the EU and place it, and invalidate it and everything, I said, bullcrap. I'm not going to do that. Love the EU, and to me, the EU will remain as some form of canonicity within the Star Wars saga, the Star Wars franchise. So I'm not going to do it. And if they wanted to fire me from Lucasfilm and Disney, fine. But, I guess Hidalgo and Chee and Kennedy and the rest of the story group, they had jobs to preserve, so they cared more about preserving their jobs in their place at Lucasfilm rather than preserving the integrity of the franchise. This I can partially understand and forgive if that was the sole reason, but unfortunately it's not. I could forgive it. I can understand it partially, even though that I disagree with it, but I can understand it. And I can even forgive it to a certain extent because you're going to put food on the table, and sometimes, like I said, you don't know what you're going to do until you're in that situation. And if you've got to put food on the table, that's your job, then maybe that will be a motivating factor to compromise. But unfortunately, that's not the only reason. I've also learned that Hidalgo and Chee have sold their, quote, soul to the devil, unquote. That's just a little personal thing for me, as I describe it, selling their soul to the devil. Because they were offered the forbidden fruit whereby they can now reimage the Star Wars EU without any oversight from George Lucas or the need to ask him permission. So, probably Iger and CEOs of Disney, when they told Lucasfilm, Kennedy and Hidalgo and Chee, that they got to get rid of, they got to invalidate the EU, Star Wars EU, decanonize it. But in so doing, they said, something, in doing so, we're offering you the exclusive right now that you can re-image, because they rebooted the EU, keep in mind, with their novels, the New Dawn, Tarkin. But the new novels that Disney is coming out, Lucasfilm Disney is coming out with, is their rebooted EU. So they offered Hidalgo and Chee, saying, hey, you can reimage the Star Wars EU in your own image. And that forbidden fruit was too tempting for them to turn down. You think of it almost like the serpent in the garden offering the forbidden fruit to Adam and Eve. It was too much of a temptation for them to turn down. Well, same thing here, because of their greed, or shall I say, arrogance, they think that they can do better than George Lucas. They no longer have to go to him to ask permission. They don't have to have any oversight from George Lucas which I'm sure he did. Like I said, he did have oversight in spite of the fact that what many people claim, that he could care less about the Star Wars EU and he had no oversight. Yes, George did have oversight of the EU. You know, he sort of let the EU authors have a little bit of freedom and creative freedom. But he did have certain oversight, like prior to the prequels coming out, he said he forbid any of the EU authors to write about the Clone Wars. And for obvious reasons, because if you read some of their ideas what the Clone Wars was, or some of the fans' ideas what the Clone Wars was, 180-degree difference between what George had in mind for the Clone Wars and the prequel trilogy. So you can understand it. So he did use oversight. But now, Hidalgo and Chee don't have to have any oversight from George, nor do they need to ask his permission. And I think that's kind of disingenuous of them. That's why they've lost all respect from me. And that's why for that reason, not only for them giving support for the decanonization of the Star Wars EU, but for the reason why, because now they get to re-image it. Their arrogance, they can get to re-image it without any oversight from George, or needing to ask his permission. For that reason alone, I refer to Leland Chee, who is formerly known, or actually now he still refers to himself as the keeper of the holocron. I refer to him as the betrayer of the holocron, because that is my conviction. That he is truly, Hidalgo and Chee, Pablo Hidalgo and Leland Chee, are the betrayer of the Star Wars holocron. And hopefully, I like to see other fans, especially fans of the EU, who are passionate about the Star Wars EU, who feel disenfranchised by Lucasfilm and Disney, who feel this passion. I like to see this term catch on as the betrayer of the holocron. Because he's got to know that that's how we feel about him. But anyway, moving on. Now it's time for the big tamale. Giving arguments. I'm going to give my arguments against the decanonization of the Star Wars EU. And I'm going to do it by starting off by giving my deductive reasoning. Then what I'm going to do is, there's 5 points I have. I'm going to go through 5 points, or 5 arguments, that all those, everyone from Hidalgo and Chee to the Disney fanboys, and also anyone else out there who is in full support of Lucasfilm and Disney and their invalidation of the Star Wars EU. Giving full support to that, I'm going to give the classical arguments, or the typical arguments that they give. Then I'm going to respond to them, what we call the apologetic, a defense against their arguments, to show how incoherent and illogical their arguments are, and why they don't stand up, and why I feel that Disney's invalidation and decanonization of the Star Wars EU is not necessary. Not only is it not necessary, but it's disingenuous, and it was wrong to do, and why the classic Star Wars EU, when I use a classic, I mean the Star Wars EU that we love, not the rebooted one that Disney has created, but the Star Wars EU that we love. The Star Wars EU that we, as diehard fans, all love, is the authentic expanded universe, the authentic Star Wars EU. And that will be the only EU that I think we will recognize. And I want to give my arguments for my defense for that position. Especially since there is so much out there on the web, and probably other YouTube videos that are trying to argue for the decanonization and invalidation of the Star Wars EU. But I'm going to start out with because starting out with arguments, presenting arguments, because I'm used to doing this, being a seminary student and learning about doing apologetics and doing arguments, theological arguments. There's different ways to do it in philosophy, inductive, but I'm going to do this as a deductive. And if you know deductive reasoning or deductive arguments, is through deduction you come up with a statement or a position, and then you look for the evidence for the reason that supports your deductive position. So let me start out by giving my deductive proposition. And then we're going to go from there and talk about give the arguments that Pablo Hidalgo, and Leland Chee give for the reasons for invalidating the EU, Star Wars EU, and all the fanboys out there, Disney fanboys, who are supporting that decision. Give the arguments that they give in support for that decision. And then I'm going to give my arguments why their decision is wrong and why my deductive proposition is right. Well, let me give with no further ado, let me give my deductive proposition. Here it is. Disney decanonized the Star Wars EU, not for any creative freedom, for that, this as a subtext, for that is just their propaganda in order to justify their decision. Keep in mind that. So I'm saying that creative freedom, needing to decanonize the EU for creative freedom, is not the real reason, but it's a propaganda. So in order to justify their decision. But on the contrary, it was solely on the basis of greed, to use the franchise as their own personal cash cow, which I feel that's what they're doing. Star Wars rakes in a lot of money, just like Marvel does. So let's buy those companies up so we can just rake in the money. Disney's invalidation of the Star Wars EU is based on the fact that they did not want to own anything that is not originally theirs, that they did not create themselves, nor did they want to be beholden to pay any royalties to any of the authors of the Star Wars EU. That's very typical. I've seen it where this is a typical thing, again, a typical thing of corporate America. I don't want to get on my politics. And I'm very political. I have very passionate feelings, but I don't like corporate America. These are the examples. This is another example of why. Because usually when they take over, I've seen it where they take over, different corporation takes over the network. So popular shows that have already existed, they want to just get rid of it. They want to get rid of everything, whether it's popular or not, and then recreate everything. Because if it's something is popular, they want to take ownership and say, hey, we're the ones who create it, we're the ones who own it. So they didn't want to own the Star Wars EU. And because it wasn't theirs. They didn't create it. So they wanted to get rid of it and then reboot it over where they can have a Star Wars EU, a rebooted EU, where they can claim ownership and they can claim that they created it. And again, I feel that's very disingenuous of Disney, but that's their motivation. Another motivation is they didn't want to pay royalties. It's greed, basic greed. I mean, for crying out loud, they're going to make millions of dollars off Star Wars. Why can't they share just a tiny bit of the profits with Timothy Zahn or Kevin J. Anderson or the other authors of the Star Wars EU? What's the problem with that? And, one of the evidence that I have is that you can see that they're starting already talking about creating characters from the EU. They're creating characters that are almost identical to the characters of the Star Wars EU that we love, like Jaina Solo or Mara Jade. They're even talking about, I've heard rumor of they're creating a character of Mara Jade, but they're calling them by different names, because if they called them Jason Solo, Jaina Solo, Mara Jade, or whatever EU character that's out there, they call them by that name, then obviously they would have to pay Timothy Zahn, Kevin J. Anderson, or whoever your favorite EU author is. They would have to pay them some royalties. And that's what they should do, rather than trying to cheat them out of it. And they are cheating them when you create a character from the EU, but call it by a different name, so you can have that character without being legally liable to pay any author some royalties. And it's just disgusting to see what's happening with that. But anyway, let's go on to my arguments. My first argument to support my proposition, my deductive proposition, is I'm going to use it from the cancellation of the Star Wars Clone Wars. Even though the Clone Wars is canon, it's not part of the Star Wars EU. I think it's important that we deal with Star Wars: The Clone Wars, because this is one piece of evidence that I want to use that supports my my deductive proposition. Okay, Lucasfilm / Disney claimed that the Star Wars: The Clone Wars was a series getting old, that it was time to move on. But the Clone Wars had one more season, season 6, because we just had before the acquisition took place. Season 5 had just finished, or 2 more seasons, which would have been up to season 7, and that's at the most. At the most, we could get season 7. So 2 more seasons. 1 season, which would have been season 6. 2 more seasons, which would have been season 6 and season 7. And that would be at the most. To finish all of its story arcs, to tie up all the loose ends, and to bring the series to a natural end. But their abrupt cancellation without letting the Clone Wars end naturally is clear evidence that Disney wanted to get rid of everything with Star Wars that is not their creation. Keep that in mind, that that's one of the things. I mean, I attended the panel on the Untold Clone Wars and Dave Filoni. Now, I know that some have claimed that Dave Filoni, they've heard him through other interviews where he sounds arrogant, and I trust their opinion. There's no reason for me not to. But I'm just saying from my experience, he seemed at the convention, I'm speaking exclusively at the Celebration Anaheim convention, he was the only one who seemed really humble and sorrowful at some of the decisions that were made. One of them being the cancellation of the Clone Wars, because everybody stood up as passionate fans of the Clone Wars, including myself, and we're asking the question, why did it need to have to be canceled before its time? It wasn't like it was in the beginning and it was interfering with Disney. It was at the end. All they had to do is give it 1 more season to let it finish up naturally, and then they could move on. So if it was getting old, and since they were closed, all they would have to do is say, okay, we consider season 6 to be its last season, let it finish naturally, tell Filoni to wrap up all the loose ends, tie up all the loose ends, and then the series naturally. That's what they could have done. And if they did it that way, then I could easily buy into their story that they ended the Clone Wars because it was time to move on, and so they can create their own series of Star Wars Rebels. But they didn't do that. They just pulled the plug. It's almost like, imagine being in a theater, watching a movie, and then halfway through the movie, an hour into the movie, the theater manager pulls the plug on your movie and says, well, okay, it's time to move on. The movie's been on long enough. Now, what kind of bullcrap is that? Because you want your full 2 hours. You paid to see a movie. You want to see it end naturally when the credits go up, not halfway through the film when the manager pulls a plug. Well, essentially, that's what Disney did. Disney pulled the plug on the Clone Wars. They said it's time to move on. Well, they wanted to do that because they wanted just to get rid of it fast, because it wasn't theirs. And they wanted to end it so they can get on to Star Wars Rebels. So again, that's sort of a form of propaganda. Their propaganda, shall I say. If it was not for George Lucas's insistence on a contractual agreement for the acquisition that the 6 saga films, as well as the Clone Wars series, remain forever as official canon, then Disney would probably try to invalidate them as well. And I truly think that. I think that George's concern was, when the acquisition took place, was that 6 saga films, episodes 1 through episode 6, would remain forever as canon, as well as the Clone Wars series that would remain forever as canon. He insisted that they would agree to that before he would sign the acquisition contract. If he didn't do that, say hypothetically, if he didn't do that, I'm pretty confident that Disney and Lucasfilm would chuck the whole thing and try to recreate Star Wars from scratch, reboot it from scratch, which that would be even more of a disaster. I probably couldn't be a Star Wars fan from that point on. Luckily, George saved it so I can, how George Lucas, in his insistence, saved Star Wars to the point that I can continue on as a fan. If not, rejecting, even if I have to reject Disney's material on Star Wars. As a matter of fact, in spite of the fact that I'm extremely grateful that we got 13 episodes of Season 6 known as The Lost Missions, I'm confident that the only reason we got those episodes is because of what George Lucas did in the contractual agreement. I'm sure that since Filoni was working on Season 6, and a lot of episodes were already completed or so, I'm assuming, but this is an educated guess, but I think it's a good educated guess, an educated opinion, that George insisted on those Lost Mission episodes being released in some format, which they were. And I'm very grateful for that, because at least it's better to have those 13 episodes than not have nothing. So even though the Clone Wars didn't have a natural ending, I am grateful for the 6 seasons, the 121 episodes that we got with the series. And I'm confident the reason why we have that is because of what George Lucas did in his insistence on the contractual agreement. With it wasn't. I don't give Disney credit for that. I give George Lucas credit for that. Another piece of evidence that Disney is trying to invalidate everything with Star Wars that is not theirs is they are basically ignoring the entire 6 saga films in the Clone Wars series, where they are while at the same time they're exclusively promoting their stuff, like Rebels and Episode VII, The Force Awakens. Now, I understand that they would, this is a time when their new stuff is brand new and they want to promote it. I have no problem with them promoting it. I have no problem with them flooding the market with Star Wars Rebels and, marketing Star Wars Rebels, and also getting ready to market stuff for Episode VII, The Force Awakens. But see, here's the problem. They're doing that at the expense of the 6 Star Wars movies. They're especially trying to ignore the prequels. I mean, the only reason why I think they have the originals in there is because of the original cast being in there. So they're making that connection with the original trilogy. But pretty much they're ignoring the entire series, the entire saga films, especially the prequels. And they're also ignoring all the material, most of the material in the Clone Wars series. I mean, Filoni's trying to incorporate it in Rebels because he's having Captain Rex come back and Ahsoka come back for Season 2. But really, if you look at what Disney's goal is they're trying to fade out and ignore everything with Star Wars that was done under Lucas's era, which is the 6 saga films and the Clone Wars series. And of course, needless to say, which is our topic, the invalidation of the Star Wars EU. So that's the evidence that I give how they're trying to ignore, and all their stuff is just propaganda, but they're really trying to ignore everything that they did not make with Star Wars, and they're trying to promote exclusively, and I say exclusively because that's the key word, their stuff, which is Rebels and Episode VII, The Force Awakens. I wouldn't have a problem with them flooding the market with their stuff, just as long as they included the canonicity of everything else. The saga films, the Clone Wars series, and the Star Wars EU. But anyway, moving on. Let's deal with the first argument Hidalgo and Chee and the Disney fanboys have. Let's deal with their first argument of why they claim that the Star Wars EU needed to be decanonized and invalidated. The Star Wars EU is, as John Campea, now keep in mind, I'm using John Campea because I consider him one of the Disney fanboys. And he used to, now I just found out, well, let me finish this. He used to be on the AMC Movie News YouTube channel. and they used to have a Jedi Council, quote-unquote Jedi Council, which comment on new Star Wars projects, especially with new Star Wars projects under Disney. And John Campea was one of the main speakers. Now, going back to my original statement, I just found out that he left this month. He left AMC. He's not doing anymore, which I say good riddance. So I really don't care about this guy. But this is a comment that he made about the Star Wars EU in one of his videos. It's quote, I'm quoting now, is a big jumbled mess of contradictions and conflicts, unquote. Now, interesting enough, Campea on this general council on the AMC YouTube channel referred to himself as Obi-Wan Kenobi, which I don't get. I just don't know. But I consider him a fraud when it comes to being a Star Wars fan. And he exposes himself to be absolutely clueless on the nature and role of the Star Wars EU, on its role as it had in the overall franchise, its canonicity and its role and its canonicity in the franchise. He's totally ignorant, and I consider him to be a total fraud. That's why I say good. There's some people I found out. I don't want to go on a rant about John Campea, but I found out that some people are really upset that he left. I'm not. I'm glad that he left. I'm not crazy about the guy. I don't wish the guy harm, but I don't like him, and I don't like his opinions. I don't share them, especially, because he says that he doesn't recognize he's a prequel hater, a Disney fanboy. Anything that Disney is doing with Star Wars has got to be great. He's a prequel hater. He doesn't even recognize the prequels, and he's in full support of the decanonization of the Star Wars EU. And just listening to him, I could see that he tries to present himself as an expert, but he's totally clueless. It would be almost like me. It would almost be like me saying about Star Wars, saying, well, imagine if I made a comment saying, well, Star Wars Episode IV, New Hope, the Death Star wasn't even built yet. Now, if I made that I can almost see the comments that would be on my YouTube channel. Every single Star Wars fan would say, you are an idiot. You don't know what you're talking about. And you know something? You guys would be right. Absolutely right. I would not know what I was talking about. Well, that's the same thing in a lot of ways. This guy makes comments about the prequels and makes comments about the Star Wars EU, and he comes off as totally clueless. I can tell that he doesn't know what he's talking about. But yet he presents himself very arrogantly as a diehard Star Wars fan who's an expert. And I don't know, I consider him a fraud when it comes to being a fan. But anyway, I've gone too much on about my rant on this guy. But anyway, let me move on. At Celebration Anaheim, on the panel of this is the title, the full title of the panel that I attended. One Big Story, subtitled "Working Within the Star Wars Canon," where Pablo Hidalgo and Leland Chee use such examples as Hutts being hermaphrodites in the Star Wars EU. Now keep in mind, a hermaphrodite is a being who has the physical qualities of both genders, both male and female, which I won't go into too much, since this is family friendly. I won't go into too much detail over sexuality with that. But anyway, when in the 6 saga films, this is what they argue, that and also the Clone Wars series, they are presented as having distinct genders. Okay, so that's one of their arguments. Their argument is that in the Star Wars EU, the Hutts are referred to as being beings of they're hermaphrodites. But in the movie, the 6 saga films, and also the Clone Wars series, each of the Hutts has a male or female gender. They don't have something that looks both transgender. They're, like Jabba the Hutt is a male. He's a man, a male Hutt. That's their argument. So they have distinct genders. They have distinct genders in the movies in the Clone Wars series. and they're referred to as hermaphrodites in the Star Wars EU, then there's a contradiction. That's what they claim. Also, too, this is another argument, and I heard this argument being used. This is the most ridiculous thing. Listen to this. And do we call the Aqualish in Episode 4, A New Hope, the Aqualish in Episode 4, A New Hope, do we call him Ponda Baba or Walrus Man? Okay, Ponda Baba or Walrus Man. And they ask, and they present this as examples of why the Star Wars EU is, quote, a big jumbled mess, unquote, that needed to be de-canonized in order to go forward with Star Wars. Now, interesting enough, you keep in mind Ponda Baba or Walrus. Maybe if you're young enough like me, you're around when the first Star Wars movie, New Hope, first came out, and they had the first line of action figures that came out. The Ponda Baba was called Walrus Man. That's what the action figure was called, Walrus Man. And, well, I'm going to get to that explanation in a second. But Ponda Baba, if you remember Dr. Evanson and Ponda Baba, remember in the cantina scene, a Mos Eisley cantina scene in Episode 4, New Hope, where this creature was bothering Luke and threatening Luke, and the good doctor, the human doctor who is his companion, said, you better watch yourself. We have the death sentence on, what was it, 12 systems. And then they tried to attack. He tried to attack. Ponda Baba tried to attack Luke, and that's when Obi-Wan pulled out his lightsaber and slashed off the arm of this creature. It was an Aqualish that was the race of Aqualish. Ponda Baba is the race of Aqualish. Well, his face looks like a walrus, and that's why they refer to him as Walrus Man. But that's who Walrus Man or Ponda Baba was, just to give you a little bit of background. Anyway, moving on. As incredibly ridiculous these asinine arguments are used to justify the invalidation of the Star Wars EU, Hidalgo and Chee are so foolish not to recognize how easy these arguments are to answer in a coherent continuity. Okay, now listen to this. I'm going to give the explanation for both of them. As for the Hutts, that can easily be answered by expressing that although the Hutts are ontologically hermaphrodites, they inherently take on the distinct characteristics of male and female gender and their personalities. So what I'm arguing for is how they can be coherently explained. And this is very easily explained, by the way. This is why I refer to both their arguments they gave at the Celebration Anaheim convention. The arguments they gave there as completely ridiculous and totally asinine. Because how easy they are to answer. The Hutts, as the Star Wars EU states, we can consider them ontologically hermaphrodites. It means in their being, their physical being, they have the physical qualities of male and female. But in their personalities, like you see in the films, the 6 films, and also the Clone Wars series, personalities, they take on the distinct factors of male and female. Like Jabba the Hutt is a male. He takes on the distinct he's not, like I said, not a transgender. He is a male. He takes on the male features. Even though that ontologically he is a hermaphrodite, he does take on the personality of a male. Very easily explained. And I would say that for the rest of the Hutts. And as far as the Aqualish, Ponda Baba goes, the Aqualish in Episode 4, New Hope, Walrus Man was a nickname given to that character decades ago, before the Star Wars mythology had a chance to develop into something complex. But Ponda Baba is referred to as his proper name. So, you go back to the late 70s when the first Star Wars movie came out, the whole Star Wars mythology wasn't fully developed as it is today. So when they came out with a line of action figures, when that action figure came out, a name wasn't given to him, a proper name wasn't given to him. So they nicknamed him because he looked like a walrus, his face looked like a walrus, They called him Walrus Man. That was the nickname that people just gave to him because that's what he looked like. But as the franchise developed its mythology as it went on, more deeper, as George created and developed the Star Wars mythology as it went on, he named the official proper name for this aqualish creature is Ponda Baba. That is his name, just like Luke Skywalker or Obi-Wan Kenobi, proper names. Well, Ponda Baba was the proper name of this aqualish creature in Episode IV: A New Hope. Easily explained. I mean, almost, I was saying not quite, but almost a kindergarten child could explain that. You know, it's strange that they would pick such ridiculous arguments. I mean, why didn't they think of something else? Before they did this panel, why didn't they sit down and think of something more, an argument that's more constructive, that's more deeper, more complex? It's almost like they pull these out of a hat. They pull these arguments out of a hat without really thinking it through. But anyway, moving on. Anyone who is half intelligent would pick a much more complex apparent, and I say apparent in quotes, that's the emphasized word, apparent, contradiction between the 6 saga films and the Star Wars EU, such as the one I originally found difficult to explain after seeing Episode II, Attack of the Clones. Okay, now here's the thing. When I saw Episode II, Attack of the Clones, back in 2002, it was an issue that was brought up, which I'm about to explain what it was. And that was very confusing. At the time, I could not reconcile the two apparent contradictory statements, but they can be. And let me explain without getting anyone confused. It was established in Kevin J. Anderson's Jedi Academy trilogy that Wilhuff Tarkin was the main architect behind the Death Star, the creation of the Death Star. But in Episode II, Attack of the Clones, it was shown that the Geonosians were the ones who were the architects of the Death Star. And what was an apparent, again I emphasize the word apparent, not actual, but apparent, contradiction, it turns out that it clearly was not. For on the Wikipedia site, it states, now this is where it gets interesting. On the Wikipedia site, it states that Tarkin was the chief architect of the Death Star, but Palpatine wanted to make advances in hypermatter science to the original plans of the Death Star. So he ordered the architect plans to be secretly handed over to the Geonosians by his apprentice, Darth Tyrannus, or aka Count Dooku. But at the time, the scene which I'm referring to in Attack of the Clones is at the time of the first Battle of Geonosius, which happened at the end of Episode II, Attack of the Clones. Archduke Poggle the Lesser, who was a leader of the Geonosians, feared that the plans would fall into the hands of the Jedi. So he handed them back over to Count Dooku, and everyone who saw the movie knows that Count Dooku took the plans, took them back to Coruscant, and put them back into the hands of Darth Sidious, aka Palpatine. So, to me, that contradiction between, the apparent contradiction between the architects of the Death Star, whether it was Tarkin and other engineers of the Empire, human engineers of the Empire, or whether it was the Geonosians, that was an apparent contradiction. I couldn't answer that at first, but that is only an apparent contradiction because, as you can see, even more complex, because I feel that apparent contradiction was more complex and a more solid example that you could have given rather than the previous two that Hidalgo and Chee gave at the convention. That was a more complex. I mean, I could buy in more to that if they use that as an example. But even that complex issue, or that complex apparent contradiction, it was and it has been easily explained and put together. Now, no one is saying that the EU, Star Wars EU, doesn't have any real contradictions. It does, but they're very minor. And I'll challenge anyone, any franchise. I don't care what it is: Star Trek, Lord of the Rings, Harry Potter, you name it, whatever franchise out there that you like, there are contradictions. It's human nature when you're writing a story to have contradictions, whether it be contradictions in and of itself within the novels or within the movie adaptations compared to the novels. So there are obviously contradictions between the Star Wars EU and with the Star Wars EU, but they're very minor, very minor. Most of the majority stuff is, and thanks to George Lucas and his oversight, is and can be reconciled with everything that George has created. The 6 saga films and the Clone Wars series can be easily reconciled. So that really, it doesn't have a foundation. There are these arguments that Hidalgo and Chee and all the fanboys, Disney fanboys, really has no validation. Calling it a big jumbled mess. No, it's not a big. The Star Wars EU is not a big jumbled mess. I'm sorry, that's just false propaganda, false statements, and it has no foundation. But anyway, moving on. And while it was claimed by Hidalgo and Chee, as well as many others who are ignorant on the subject, that George Lucas never declared the Star Wars EU to be canon, for while that is not entirely true, the format that George Lucas treated the Star Wars EU was a perfect way to deal with any, quote, any true, unquote, but minor contradictory material. George Lucas has stated that he was never beholden to the Star Wars EU, but that he reserved the rights to artistic freedom for his saga. But he also stated that he really liked the Star Wars EU, and he showed it by incorporating a lot of material and characters from the Star Wars EU into the prequel trilogy and the Clone Wars series. Now, keep in mind that's how George did it, because a lot of it, you hear again Hidalgo and Chee, a lot of these Disney fanboys. As a matter of fact, even a couple young guys that I met at this panel at the convention, claimed, you were telling me, I got an argument with them because they were telling me, the EU was never declared canon, and George didn't care about it, he didn't consider it canon. And I argued with them about that. I said, that's simply not true. The way you're stating it, it's simply not true. And now the way George treated it is, there's different layers. If you go on the Wikipedia site, there's the different layers of canonicity, the different levels and the hierarchy of canonicity that you have. And I don't want to go into that because I'm going to be honest, I don't want to lie. I'm not quite sure how everything fits within that hierarchy, but I do know about the hierarchy, and I accept it. But the way George had that hierarchy, obviously the highest hierarchy is Star Wars George Lucas created. That has the absolute highest hierarchy, shall I say, the top one, which is the 6 saga films and the Clone Wars series that, they are the absolute canon. But the Star Wars EU also has canonicity. And George had oversight, but he also let the authors have a little bit of creative freedom for themselves to invent the Star Wars EU according to the stories that they wanted to tell. And he left it that way so it would be you could easily go in and examine the Star Wars EU and what he felt that was off, where he wasn't, direction where he wasn't going. Obviously, he could state that this is not canon, but obviously he stated there was a lot of material that he really did like from Star Wars EU, and he added that into the prequel trilogy, as well as Filoni adding a lot of stuff into the Clone Wars series. So you can see that there was a lot of material and characters that George liked that he considered as official canon. That was a perfect way to deal with the Star Wars EU. But it's changed now. Ever since since Lucasfilm has changed hands, the position of the Star Wars EU has changed as well. The current position of Lucasfilm / Disney, that their new rebooted Star Wars EU going forth will be made official and unchangeable canon by the Lucasfilm / Disney Story Group, is quite problematic. For when in the future they do have contradictions have contradictions in their Star Wars EU, which they most certainly will, then they will have little to no room to retract any of those contradictions. This is a problem that George Lucas never had to face with his method of canonicity he placed on the Star Wars EU. You see it, you understand that everybody, what Hidalgo and Chee and all the Star Wars fanboys think that it's so ingenious is now that Disney has taken over Lucasfilm, that the story group has been put together by Kathleen Kennedy, that now is going forth, they can check every little thing with going forward with this rebooted EU. And so therefore they want to declare everything as absolute canon. But that's very problematic because they're going to have contradictions. It's human nature. Now, George had that problem solved because he had the hierarchy of canonicity, which he can retract certain things that he felt weren't canon. But since everything is canon now to Disney, the Disney Lucasfilm group, what are they going to do when they come across contradictory? And guarantee they're going to have contradictory material. It's human nature. You can't escape human nature. To be flawed is human, and human beings make mistakes, and they're going to make mistakes. So what are you going to do? You can't when you don't allow yourself to be able to retract everything's absolute canon. How are you going to be able to retract anything that's contradictory? And by the way, from what I heard, now I'm not following. Anybody who knows, I'm boycotting the Disney Star Wars EU, the rebooted EU. So I don't follow that. But I was informed by other people who are reading it or involved in it of a little boo-boo that they did make, where supposedly, I think, if I'm not mistaken, keep in mind I haven't read this, I'm going by third-hand information, that Darth Vader, there was a comic, Star Wars comic with Darth Vader, this is under the Disney rebooted EU, Darth Vader was on Tatooine, did not even sense Obi-Wan's presence. Contradiction. Remember in episode 4 when Obi-Wan was wandering around the Death Star, Vader constantly, he was telling Tarkin, he says, I feel a presence I have not felt in a while, and he couldn't get it out of his mind. He kept saying, I feel Obi-Wan is here. Strong presence when Obi-Wan was close by on the Death Star in episode 4, New Hope. Why didn't he have that same feeling in the comic when he was on Tatooine? Major problem. If that's the case, if that third-hand information is correct, major contradiction. And this is early in the game for the new rebooted EU. Imagine what other contradictions they're going to have in the future as it goes on. So, anyway, I think I've said enough on that. Hopefully I've made my case on the problematic issue of Disney Lucasfilm, Disney's rebooted EU and its problematic issues, and how well that George handled the classic EU and his level of hierarchy of canonicity. Hopefully I've made my case with that. But anyway, let's move on. Let's go to the next argument that Hidalgo and Chee and all this Disney fanboys use to defend the decanonization of the Star Wars EU. Okay. This is what they say. People want to see new stories and not adaptations of already existing novels. So this is what they're arguing for. That, since the Star Wars EU has been out, their novels, everybody knows these stories. They read them and they know them. So basically, they've become sort of like old stories. People don't want to see adaptations of old stories. They want to see new stories. This is what they argue. Why the Star Wars, under the assumption that a lot of fans would expect movie adaptations of the Star Wars EU novels. So this is what they argue with why the Star Wars EU needed to be decanonized and invalidated. This is one of their arguments. And this is my response. Even if Lucasfilm were to do movie adaptations on the Star Wars EU novels, that would not be a bad thing. For there was 8 movie adaptations that were made of J.K. Rowling's Harry Potter 7-book series, and they were all very highly successful. And I'm sure that there are many, like myself, who never read any of the novels but who love the movies, because I really enjoyed all the Harry Potter movies. I consider myself a Harry Potter fan. I'm not gonna lie about that. I admit that. I confess that. I'm a Harry Potter fan. It wasn't in the beginning. Before the first movie came out, I thought it was some stupid kids thing. But after seeing the movies, now my sister read the books and saw the movies. She loved both. I just saw the movies, and I love the movies. So, like I said, there's probably many like me, who never read the novels, but who saw the movies and loved them. The Harry Potter movies were highly successful with both those who read the novels and those who did not. So, like I said, my sister saw the movies and she read the books and she loved them, and I just saw the movies. I didn't read the books, I didn't read the novels, but I love the movies. And I'm pretty sure that the population in America and also in the UK share that same thing, that there's some who both read the novels and saw the movies, and some who just saw the movies. But needless to say, Harry Potter was a very successful movie series adaptation. As a matter of fact, most of the highly successful films, some of them that have even gone on to become classics, are adaptations from novels, such as Lord of the Rings series, Jurassic Park, Jaws, The Exorcist, and the Stephen King movie adaptations such as Carrie, Salem's Lot, The Shining, and The Stand. So why wouldn't they assume that this would be successful with the classic Star Wars EU? Why would they make a statement saying, "Oh, nobody wants movie adaptations of the Star Wars EU novels"? Because there are so many classic novels that people have been fans for years that they made movies of, and they were highly successful. And so since they were highly successful, why wouldn't you assume the same thing would be true for the Star Wars EU? Again, the argument just doesn't fit. It has no foundation, it has no coherency. It's almost like they're pulling these arguments out of their hat to try to. They're trying so hard to justify the decision to invalidate the Star Wars EU, that they're pulling these propaganda statements out of a hat without really thinking them through, because they have no foundation, they're illogical, they're incoherent, and they really are not good arguments. I mean, the arguments I gave there, history proves them wrong. With all these successful movie adaptations from novels that you've had for decades, there's no doubt in my mind that movie adaptations from a lot of the Star Wars EU novels would be just as successful. So that statement is their statement, shall I say, Hidalgo and Chee and the Disney fanboys, their statement there, that they wouldn't, is just it doesn't hold up. It doesn't hold water. There's no solid foundation for that. Let's go on to their next argument. This is the next argument that they make. The Star Wars EU needed to be scrapped so to have creative freedom going forth and creating new Star Wars stories. Okay, now this is very similar to the other argument that distinct but similar to the previous argument that I just was talking about, where no one wants to see movie adaptations of these older stories that are adaptations from the Star Wars EU novels. Very similar, but this is distinct, because what they're arguing with is, if we want to go ahead and make new Star Wars stories that are not adaptations from the Star Wars EU novels, then we can't, because obviously if we make the sequel trilogy, they're going to be contradictory with the Star Wars EU. So the only way we can go forward with that is we have to decanonize the EU so we can start fresh with the sequel trilogy. Well, that also has no basis, which I'm about to explain. Let me explain why. No one said that the sequel trilogy needed to be adaptations of any of the Star Wars EU novels. For I think George Lucas's plan, now keep in mind, I just got word, before I go on, I apologize for pausing on this part, but I just got word, and there's every reason to believe it, that word that George Lucas has revealed some of his ideas that he had for the sequel trilogy. If you know, anyone who knows, is that with the acquisition, he turned over treatments for the sequel trilogy, for the 3 films, episodes 7, 8, and 9. Treatments, outlines of the stories that he expected to see for the sequel trilogy. Well, the second that the acquisition took place and they were handed over and they got J.J. Abrams to do the sequel trilogy, they were chucked. They were canned. And they had J.J. Abrams go back and redo. And not only is that disingenuous, but I think, in my opinion, that's a breach of contract. I think George has a case to go to court and bring a lawsuit against Disney for doing that. But I'm not going to go into that. That's just my opinion. But anyway, George finally revealed, from what I hear, of his treatments. He revealed what he had in mind in his treatments for the sequel trilogy. But I think George Lucas's plan and his treatments was for the sequel trilogy to take place farther in the future, probably beyond the fate of the Jedi series. Okay, so basically the fate of the Jedi series, I'm trying to think, 30, 40 years or something like that beyond the events of Episode VI, Return of the Jedi. That was the last series that they had for the Star Wars EU before it was cut off and decanonized. So I think what George had is for the sequel trilogy to take place many more decades or many years beyond that. Who knows, maybe it was 100 years. I'm not sure. I just know it was beyond the time. It was beyond the time period where J.J. Abrams' project will happen, which is 30 years. The sequel trilogy will pick up 30 years after the events of Episode VI, Return of the Jedi. Okay, this way they could have told fresh new stories without it contradicting anything established in the Star Wars EU. So basically, what George had in mind, which would have been perfect, is if he had the sequel trilogy set beyond where the Star Wars EU left off at in Fate of the Jedi. That would have been perfect because there would have been no contradictions of the story context and the continuity of what was going on in Star Wars EU with the events of what's going on in the sequel trilogy. They could be two distinct stories. The sequel trilogy could have been fresh new stories that took place after the time period of the Star Wars EU. So no contradiction, no problem. So this statement that Hidalgo and Chee and the Star Wars fanboys say, well, hey, if you have the sequel trilogy and the Star Wars EU is continuity, then they're going to both contradict one another. We need to decanonize, we need to invalidate the Star Wars EU so the sequel trilogy will be fresh. Nonsense. George had if this is true from what I'm hearing of the story, that George's plans for his treatments for the sequel trilogy was to take place far in the future, beyond where the Star Wars EU, and also beyond where J.J. Abrams, The Force Awakens is going to, Episode VII, The Force Awakens is going to take place, which is 30 years after Return of the Jedi. Then essentially, there would have been no contradiction. The sequel trilogy could have been totally fresh, new story altogether, never covered, not taking place within the continuity of the Star Wars EU, and no contradiction. Perfect solution. So that has no foundation. They have no foundation in that, and their arguments for that. But keep in mind, Disney did not go with this option because they wanted to be able to cash in on American cultural popularity of the original cast members, especially the likes of Harrison Ford. So basically what I'm saying here is what George's proposal was for the sequel trilogy to take place far in the future. Let's say hypothetically took place 100 years after Episode VI, Return of the Jedi. That would obviously be beyond the life expectancy of the humans, at least the humans, maybe not Chewbacca, but at least the humans, like Luke and Leia and Han and such, would be beyond their life expectancy, so they would have died of old age, you would expect. So they would not, Luke and Leia and Han would not be in the sequel trilogy. It would be new characters. Well, Disney didn't go with this idea because essentially what they're trying to do, like I said, they're trying to cash in on Star Wars. They're trying to use the Star Wars franchise as their own cash cow. And the best way to max out is to use favorable characters, because when Star Wars Episode IV, New Hope came out, the original trilogy played, they became part of pop culture. So not only diehard Star Wars fans like myself, and like you guys who are watching this video, not only you guys are interested to see the old cast come back, Mark Hamill and Carrie Fisher and Harrison Ford come back to reprise their roles, but everyone is, people who are not Star Wars fans, who just want to go see an action film. Everyone knows who Luke Skywalker is and Princess Leia and Han Solo, and they're going to want to see these actors and actresses reprise their roles. That's just the best way to maximize on cashing in on the popularity of Star Wars. If they use, I guess Disney is thinking, just like others think, corporate America thinks, that if you use new characters, yeah, you'll attract the fans, but you won't attract a whole lot of other people who are non-Star Wars fans. But hey, if you put Luke Skywalker in and Han Solo and Princess Leia, everybody's going to come. I think that was really the thinking behind J.J. Abrams with Star Trek, because instead of taking the characters from the original series and destroying the canonicity of all of Star Trek history, 40 years of Star Trek history, instead of doing that, they could have done what the other shows have done. Each new generation, or each new Star Trek series did, is start off with another crew, because Star Trek universe, just like Star Wars, is big enough that it can expand out to different characters and explore different characters in that universe. So they could have so J.J. Abrams, for his films, he could have made another crew. He could have created another crew, starship crew, for his stories. But he didn't go that way, because if you create a brand new crew, yes, Star Trek fans are going to go see it, but there's a lot of other non-Star Trek fans. People just want to go see a movie. They think they're not going to be able to relate to it, and they're not going to go see it. But if but hey, if you got Captain Kirk, you got a Star Trek movie, Captain Kirk and Mr. Spock and Dr. McCoy. Oh, yeah, everybody's going to come, because they're culture icons, just like Luke Skywalker and Han Solo and Princess Leia are culture icons. So everybody's going to come see them, and that's just their way of maxing out and using the franchise as a cash cow. And that's my opinion. That's why I think that's the reason why they didn't go with Lucas's treatments, because they figured that wouldn't maximize their profits. Only if you place it 30 years after, where you have which is ironically, it's interesting, because having it 30 years after Episode VI, Return of the Jedi, to Episode VII, The Force Awakens, is the same amount of years in real life between when they made that film in 1983 till now. It's been 30 years. So the actors have aged 30 years, so the aging of the characters will match the aging of the actors. which is interesting. So, but they want it in the lifetime of the characters, so they can have the classic characters, so they can maximize on their profits with the popularity of American culture. That's my opinion on why they. That's my opinion on why they scrapped Lucas's treatments, which I think is very disingenuous of them to do. But anyway, hopefully I've made my case against that argument, the EU needing to be scrapped for creative freedom. Hopefully I made my case for that. And but moving on, this is the next argument. This is another very popular argument that Hidalgo and Chee and the Disney fanboys use for needing to discredit, de-canonize, and discredit the Star Wars EU. This is the fifth argument, or another popular argument that Hidalgo and Chee, as well as the Star Wars fanboys, use. I mean, not Star Wars fanboys, Disney fanboys use for needing to decanonize the Star Wars EU and invalidate it. This is what they say. A younger generation will not be able to relate to the Star Wars EU, so it needed to be scrapped and rebooted for a newer generation of fans. Very popular argument. I think this is one of the worst arguments. Now, I'm going to explain so in a second. But it's the idea that they're arguing that, hey, we've got a whole new younger generation, the millennial generation, which I'm not too favorable of this generation, because this millennial generation that's growing up now is holds the most, has the most lack of intelligence, lack of wisdom, and decency of social skills. So they don't impress this millennial generation doesn't really impress me as much. But they're saying that we have to appeal to this newer millennial generation, and they can't relate to the old Star Wars. They can't really relate to the movies, or the 6 movies, or the Clone Wars series, and especially cannot relate to the Star Wars EU. So that needed to be scrapped, and we need to reboot the Star Wars EU so they can relate to it. This is what their argument is. This is my counter argument to demonstrate why that statement is a horrible argument and an incoherent one as well. Making assumptions that a younger generation who are getting into Star Wars for the first time would be confused by the huge canon that the franchise has created over the past decades is a completely flawed assumption. When George Lucas was creating the prequel trilogy, he did not take away from the Star Wars EU, but added a lot of material and even characters from the Star Wars EU into all 3 chapters of the prequel trilogy. Now, many young people who never saw the original trilogy or read any of the Star Wars EU, but followed the prequel trilogy, none of them got confused by any of the Star Wars EU material or characters. The same would be true, or should be true, for the sequel trilogy. So understand this, that my first argument why that argument holds no water, has no foundation, is the fact of, look at the history of what George did with the prequel trilogy. There was many younger generations, close to the millennial generation, who never saw the original Star Wars original trilogy, either in theater or even a lot of them not even on video. So their first experience with Star Wars was the prequel trilogy. And George added a lot of characters and material in from the Star Wars EU. So they got that. They were able to get, maybe you can credit that with the genius of the Star Wars EU, but you can also credit that with the genius of George Lucas. And everybody, there's so many people who like to trash the prequel trilogy, but the writing of George Lucas, he was able to incorporate these materials and these characters in. And so this younger generation who never saw the original trilogy or never read Star Wars EU could relate to the characters and material that were presented in the prequel trilogy, that were also incorporated from the Star Wars EU. So they did that. Why not make the same assumption with good writing skills for the sequel trilogy? Why not make the same assumption with comparison with the Star Wars EU and the sequel trilogy? I think if a good writer did that, the same would be true for this younger millennial generation with the sequel trilogy going forward. But anyway, moving on. My last point being that the fear that the younger generation getting confused by the Star Wars EU material and characters in the sequel trilogy should never be a reason for invalidating the classic Star Wars EU. Science fiction inherently has built into its genre a reward system for those fans who follow its franchise faithfully and learns the mythology of its rich continuity. And every time a corporation decides to reboot a science fiction franchise, well, let me back up. I'm getting a little ahead of myself. First thing I want to emphasize, science fiction is a very deep concept. Deep people, intelligent people, are the kind of people who really enjoy science fiction. So if you're one of the ones who love science fiction, love Star Wars or Doctor Who, watches my videos, consider yourself as one of the people who are very intelligent, very deep and very intelligent. Think deeper on a deeper level than just, a very surface, a very basic surface level of kind of thinking. You think deeper, you're more intelligent, etc. Science fiction has a reward system inherently. A franchise has a reward system. That means if you followed it, you should be rewarded. That means, like when you're watching a movie or TV series that is that's following on the heels of several years or even several decades of history of a franchise, you're going to get little Easter eggs, like, Marvel movies. Amazingly enough, the Marvel movies, under Disney, nonetheless, have their little. If you've been following, as my friends, I have friends who follow Marvel Comics ever since we were little kids. Ever since I knew them since we were little kids. And they can watch the Marvel movies and pick out little Easter eggs. Oh yeah, that was from comic such and such. That was, Captain America's suit or Iron Man's suit from this. They can pick out these little Easter eggs that fans would pick up. And that's a reward system for those who think much deeper and are much more intelligent and who follow the franchise faithfully. They're rewarded with these little Easter eggs. And essentially, that's what the science fiction genre does. So to cut an entire franchise off and decanonize it and start fresh and new defeats that purpose. And is a smack in the face to all the loyal fans who've been following the franchise for all these years. But let me move on. And every time a corporation decides to reboot a science fiction franchise, they always alienate the loyal die-hard fans who have faithfully followed the franchise over the years. And in losing them, they never are able to replace the loyal older fans they lost with the newer fans from the younger generation. It never works. Trust me, it never works. Plus, every rebooted science fiction franchise pales in its storytelling and mythology than what the original was. Just look at the classic Star Trek series versus J.J. Abrams' Star Trek films. Or the original Battlestar Galactica series to the new Battlestar Galactica series. And basically what I'm saying is, first of all, they're thinking, the corporate mind, again, going back to this corporate mind, thinks, okay, well, in order to appeal to a newer generation, we've got to sort of either decanonize or ignore the past with the franchise and just reboot it. And their assumption is the diehard fans are going to faithfully follow it. But also you're going to attract newer fans too, because newer fans who've never followed it, can't relate to it, the older stuff will follow the new stuff. That never works out. I think it's almost like a win-win. The older loyal fans are going to follow it and enjoy it and love it, support it. And they're also going to get newer fans who are going to love it and follow it and enjoy it and support it. Never works that way. Never. What happens is all the older, faithfully loyal fans who followed the franchise over the years are going to abandon it. They're going to feel betrayed, disenfranchised, and they're going to abandon it. They're going to stop following it. And the newer fans that they hope to replace the older fans with, they're not going to be able to do it. They're going to lose the fans that they already have, the loyal fans that they already have, and they're not going to gain any newer ones with the younger generation. It's just not going to work. It never has worked, never will work. Plus, keep in mind, whenever they reboot something, it's just like, with remakes with movies. You have a classic movie, and then they remake the movie. The remake of the movie never holds up water compared to the classic. A lot of people will say the remake, but it was only the original movie, the original version, which people will go see over and over again. That's just the nature. Well, the same goes with franchises. If you reboot a franchise, it's never the same. Not only does it not supersede or succeed past the original, but it's subpar to the original. And many people watch the new, rebooted one, but it's the old classic one, like Star Trek. Many fans have seen J.J. Abrams' 2 Star Trek films. But that's it. They see it. They don't support it. They don't like it. Really don't support it. But the classic Star Trek series with Kirk, Spock, and McCoy, William Shatner, Leonard Nimoy, and DeForest Kelley in the role of the classic series, the fans and other people alike are going to go back to that series over and over and over and over. It's going to be to the end of time, for all their entire life. Because this new rebooted series, or the new rebooted Star Trek is never going to replace the original. The original is the best. And that's the same thing. The original Star Wars is the best. The 6 saga films, the Clone Wars series, and the classic EU. You cannot replace the Disney's new rebooted EU with the classic one, because the classic one will always be genuine. The classic Star Wars EU will be the classic Star Wars EU. It will be the classic, and it will be the one that diehard fans always return to over and over again, and it's the only one that they will support. And the Disney new rebooted EU will be how shall I say it? Will always be subpar. Would be subpar, and that's speaking very highly of it. That's probably giving a compliment to it. Will be subpar to the classic Star Wars EU that we all grew up with and loved and followed throughout the years for the past 4 decades. And that's the reason why I have officially decided, I'm only sticking, as far as the Star Wars EU, anything that's expanded universe comics or novels or whatever, the only Star Wars EU that I will be involved with will be the classic one. I've decided to boycott all of Disney's rebooted EU material. I will not read it. I will not have anything to do with it. As a matter of fact, I don't even recognize it. Just as John Campea doesn't even recognize the prequel trilogy. He says he doesn't even recognize it as part of canon. Well, touche. I don't recognize Disney's rebooted Star Wars EU as canon. I don't recognize it. I don't read it. I don't have anything to do with it. The only Star Wars EU that I will have to do with is the classic, the one that we all love. That's the one I consider to be canon, and that's the only Star Wars EU that I will acknowledge. So, well, there you go. That's my position. And I think hopefully I made my case for that. One last statement. A friend of mine once said to me that when a corporation reboots a science fiction show, they lose the loyal fans who were disenfranchised, and they never make their goal of attracting the ones who never were into it, for they could care less how a franchise has changed, for they simply are not into it and never will be. So his argument goes, when they try to reboot it and try to make it over new for a younger generation or for other people who've never been into the franchise because they, quote unquote, they can't relate to it, they end up disenfranchising and losing the loyal fans, which was probably not their intention. But they never gain, like I said in my previous statement, they never gain the newer ones, the newer fans. They think that they think they attract these newer fans because, hey, look, we've changed it, we've remade it, now you can relate to it. But to be honest with you, they make such a false presupposition, because these newer people they're trying to attract, they were never into science fiction to begin with, and they certainly are not going to be interested in this new version that this corporation has created, because to them they don't care. They simply just do not care. They don't care about science fiction. They don't care. They've never cared about the franchise, not because they can't relate to it, but because they just never have. It's a simple fact, and it's the end of the story for that on that when it comes to their interest or lack thereof. And that's what Hidalgo and Chee and the Disney fanboys and all these other corporations, corporate minds think, is that they seem to forget that they're not going to attract the newer ones, not because they can't relate to it, but because they were never into it, and they never will be, and they're not, and because of that, they're just simply not going to be interested in this new version that they created. So, anyway, hopefully I have said my piece with that. I think it's about time that I end this blog. Hopefully I've done justice to my defense for the classic Star Wars EU, and also done justice to make arguments against Hidalgo and Chee and the Disney fanboys on their arguments for why the Star Wars EU needed to be decanonized and invalidated. Hopefully I've made a good case against those arguments, and a good case not only against their arguments, but a good case in defending Star Wars EU as needing to remain as canon. So I appreciate your comments. I would love to hear from you. Now everybody should know my my actual position as of date, especially from a year ago, from the original video I did on the canonicity of the Star Wars EU. So you can watch that video, but you can also compare it to this one, which I will refer if anybody makes comments on my original video, I will ask them to watch this video to get the updated view of where my position is on the Star Wars EU and the controversy over Disney's invalidation of it. But anyway, in ending this blog, I wanted to thank you, and I want to thank everyone for watching this video. And for all those who like my video, I would like to ask you to subscribe to my channel so you will get all the latest updates. Like I said, I cherish all my subscribers. I really love you guys who subscribe. I appreciate you beyond measure for subscribing, and I appreciate your comments. And I always try, sometimes it might take me a little while, but I always try to respond to all comments that are given to me. So I do ask you to subscribe to my channel so you get all the latest updates. And like I said, I've made my outline plan for all the topics I will cover from now to the end of the year 2015. So next month, the month of August, will be on the topic of Doctor Who Mythology number 2, Gallifrey and the Time Lords. And with that, I would like to bid everyone a good day, and may the Force be with you.